Welcome to all of you for this third and last day of this wonderful conference on Missio Day and the tasks of mission. As for myself, I am Gianni Criveller. I am a missionary of the PIME Institute. PIME stands for Pontifical Institute for Foreign Missions. And I've been a missionary myself among the Chinese people for nearly 30 years with my physical body, but now I continue to follow up and I will return to my mission. Presently, I am the director of the PIME Missionary Center in Milan, and consequently also the director of the news agency Asia News, an agency in 4 languages about Asia, and the journal Mondo e Missione, which is the longest publishing magazine in Italy in absolute. And I am also a president of the International Association of Catholic Missiologists, an association that has a beautiful name with a beautiful mission, only that we are very weak association. We hardly survive. We do not perform along the expectations, but we will continue humbly to do what we can do under the circumstances. But I'm here today to introduce with great joy our speaker for today, Professor Catherine Cornille, who is a professor of comparative theology at the Boston College in the United States, where she holds the Newton College Alumni Chair of Western Culture. Her teaching and research focus on theology of religions, comparative theology, and interreligious dialogue. Her recent publications include Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology and Atonement and Comparative Theology, The Cross in Dialogue with Other Religions. She is founding editor-in-chief of the book series Christian Commentaries on Non-Christian Sacred Texts. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me to give the word and the table and the floor to Professor Cornille.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here, very happy to be among you. It's of course terribly sad that Felix Wilfred could not be with us today, and I want to just take a moment to remember him and his importance in the world of theology and missiology. Felix Wilfred was one of the most prominent Indian Catholic theologians. He, at a very young age already, he was part of the International Theological Committee. He was the president of Concilium for about 10 years. He really saved that journal from extinction in around 2000. He edited a huge volume on Christianity in Asia. He was editor of the Journal for Asian Christianities, and I can go on and on. So he was really a very important theologian, and it's with great regret that he could not be here, of course, today because he passed away in January, so I just did want to remember him. So my own talk is on prospects for Interreligious Missio Dei. Christian discussions on the relationship between mission and interreligious dialogue over the past decades have mainly focused on the distinction between the two, usually in an attempt to save Christian mission from being swallowed up and reduced to friendly dialogue between religions. The rise and popularity of interreligious dialogue had put some pressure on traditional understanding of mission, what is the relevance or urgency of proclaiming the gospel in distant lands if every religion is thought to possess elements of goodness and truth? Why suffer the pangs of exile and the stings of mosquitoes? This is a line from Power, quoted in Bosch, if people are saved anyway. Moreover, if interreligious dialogue is understood as a form of mutual witnessing to the truth of one's own religion, as I have claimed in the past, is there even a need for a separate activity called mission? So in the Vatican document, the 1991 Vatican document, Dialogue and Proclamation, there's an attempt to distinguish proclamation from dialogue. Nevertheless, they still emphasize the relationship between the two. When it states, true interreligious dialogue on the part of the Christian supposes the desire to make Christ better known, recognized, and loved. And then the second part is, proclaiming Jesus Christ is to be carried out in the gospel spirit of dialogue. So in my previous work, I have mostly focused on the former, emphasizing that interreligious dialogue is not just an exchange of knowledge, but a witnessing to the truth of one's own tradition also, a mutual witnessing to the truth of one's own tradition. So that has been what I have done in the past, but what I would like to do today is the opposite and look at how interreligious dialogue can actually enrich mission and make for fruitful interreligious Missio Dei. So first of all, interreligious Missio Dei, of course, itself presupposes the recognition of other religions as containing elements of goodness and truth. And already the first day, we saw that in the document Nostra Aetate, there's an emphasis that there are elements of goodness and truth that enlightened all human beings that are acknowledged in that document. So for interreligious Missio Dei, this forms a very important foundation or a basis for engaging other religious traditions in our mission. And in the course of the past 2 or 3 decades, theologians of religions and missiologists have, of course, developed that idea much further. And Bosch himself emphasizes that what is necessary is an attitude that he calls humble conviction or bold humility or humble boldness as important attitudes for both mission and dialogue. And in my own work, I have also emphasized a lot the importance of epistemic humility in interreligious dialogue, because if one believes that one has the fullness of truth and there is nothing to be learned from other religious traditions, what would even be the point of engaging in other religious traditions? And there are, of course, as we saw this morning in our prayer and in our tradition, plenty of resources for grounding that epistemic humility in the Christian tradition. Now, in the spirit of humility, I have to admit that I have myself very limited experience with mission and very lack of depth in missiologists, but I have been fortunate to be friends with some very important missionaries who I admire greatly and from whom I have learned a lot. And I just want to acknowledge them here. On the right, you see an image of a Jesuit missionary. His name is Anthony Corcoran. He has worked and lived in Russia for many years, was a missionary in Siberia, was in the provincial of the Jesuits in Moscow, and is now apostolic delegate in Kyrgyzstan, where he lives among a predominantly Muslim population. On the top right, you see Jan Vanieux. He's a missionary of the Mission Étrangère de Paris, who lives in Varanasi, in the Ghats in Varanasi, where he shares his life with Hindus and Muslims and lives a life of dialogue also in that place. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention also my good friend and your confrere, James Heisig, who has been living in Japan for over 40 years and has been working on dialogue with Buddhism, in particular Buddhist philosophy, and has produced very important works engaging Christianity with Buddhism. So these are, I think, exemplars for me, very important people who inspire my reflections on Interreligious Missio Dei. Now, I have 4 ways in which I think we can envision what Interreligious Missio Dei might mean. And so I will go through them one by one. So the first way in which we can envision or imagine an Interreligious Missio Dei is in the form of learning as an avenue from learning about and from other religious traditions. And this touches, of course, very close to my own field, which is comparative theology. So comparative theology is a way of doing theology in dialogue with other religious traditions. So doing theology, engaging one or the other religious traditions. So comparative theologians are firmly grounded in a particular religious tradition, but also have profound knowledge of at least one other religious tradition, and use that knowledge to enrich and inform and deepen the Christian understanding of truth. So it is really profoundly confessional, in general, theology that engages other religious traditions. Now, in discussions on comparative theology, people have said it's sort of an run of theology of religions or of comparative religion, but I actually believe that it has most in common with missiology and with mission theology, because the early forerunners of comparative theology were actually missionaries, people like Henri Le Sceau, B. Griffiths, Raymond Panikar, Shigetu Oshida, Louis Massignon, all of these missionaries who went into other lands and engaged in deep dialogue with other religious traditions. So in order to enculturate Christianity in another culture, they had, of course, to learn about the traditions that had informed that culture. And so Aloysius Pieris, for example, talks about enculturation as in-religionization, because, of course, other cultures are not just bare of any religious content. They are all informed by religions that gave them form in the past. So engaging in other religious traditions means engaging in the religions that have informed those cultures. And these missionaries, in trying to do that, were often deeply inspired also by the traditions that they were studying. So what we see is that these missionaries, even though they didn't use the term comparative theology, were, in my estimation, real pioneers of comparative theology. And in some cases, I would say even went further than contemporary comparative theologians in really engaging other religious traditions. I will just give you a quote from Henri Le Sceau, who famously stated that if Christianity should prove to be incapable of assimilating Hindu spiritual experience from within, Christianity would thereby lose the right to claim that it is the universal way of salvation. So this is a very strong statement. And his whole effort to enculturate Christianity in India also shows, of course, the possibilities, but also the limits of engaging with other religious traditions. But at least he was incredibly courageous in pushing the limits of Christian theology and engaging with other religious traditions. The famous Henri de Lubac, who himself was inspired by some of these comparative theologians, stated, "Doesn't the only efficient way to discern the truth that is hidden and to avoid suffocating the goodness that seeks to show itself consist in a systematic willingness to study with sympathy the thoughts that seem to us the most distant, and to attach ourselves in this study to privileged cases, as rare as they may seem? since it is by its summits that humanity must be understood. So these are the words of de Lubac, who cannot be, accused of lack of orthodoxy, but but you see how this push towards engagement with other religious traditions really comes out of the history of missiology and missionary engagement with these other religious traditions. So in my own book, Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology, that was mentioned and published in 2020, I discuss 6 ways of learning from other religious traditions. And the 6 ways that I discuss systematically in that book are intensification, rectification, reinterpretation, recovery, appropriation, and reaffirmation. I can't go into all of these ways of learning from other religious traditions, but in each of these ways of learning, there are ways of also learning from the history of missionary engagement with other religious traditions. And so the purpose of comparative theology is really to not only enrich the Christian tradition by engaging with other religious traditions, but also to establish its plausibility in a world of religious diversity. So it's not only to take or appropriate or borrow from other religious traditions, but it's in the end also about giving back, and we will come to that in a little while. So this is well, I just, to end this this way of doing Interreligious Missio Dei, I want to just also quote David Bosch again, who states that, one moment, where is the quote? Insofar as theology is missiology, and missiology also involves interreligious dialogue and comparative theology, theology itself can no longer be practiced without some engagement with other religious traditions. And he says, more than ever before, more than ever has been the case since Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge in 312, Christian theology is a theology of dialogue. So comparative theology, I would say, is one way of imagining an interreligious Missio Dei. The second way of thinking about an interreligious Missio Dei is to learn about mission itself from other religious traditions. So learning about the ways other religious traditions proselytize, both in terms of its form and its content. And here I have a quote from Pope John Paul II, who states in the document Ecclesia in Asia, he states, "Mission is contemplative action and active contemplation. Therefore, a missionary who has no deep experience of God in prayer and contemplation will have little spiritual influence over missionary success. This is an insight drawn from my own priestly ministry and, as I have written elsewhere, my contact with representatives of the non-Christian spiritual traditions, particularly those in Asia." So here you see the Pope affirming the importance of learning from other religious traditions, even in the way we practice mission. And this learning can be derived also in various ways. So one way in which the learning can be understood is from the way in which other religious traditions seem to appeal to Christian believers themselves. So I have written quite a lot also on the phenomenon of religious hybridity or multiple religious belonging. And in the past, I have been mostly critical of the phenomenon, but I think there is also a lot that we can learn from the way and the reasons why Christians are attracted to other religious traditions. And this may be sometimes out of dissatisfaction with the Christian tradition, but sometimes it's also out of a sense of inspiration and insight that is received, a kind of surplus that other religious traditions might offer to Christian believers. And I think that is also an important message for Christian theology and mission, to look at what it is in other religious tradition that seems to appeal to Christian believers. And what we can learn from that often is that whatever is appealing in other religions is often also present but hidden in the Christian tradition itself. So sometimes what is appealing in other religions is contradictory with the Christian message, but sometimes, and I would say even more often than not, these are elements that are also part of the Christian tradition itself. So I think we can learn from, you can say, the mission of other religions, or the way other religions draw Christian believers, what we need to rediscover and reawaken in our own Christian tradition, aspects that have been forgotten or marginalized or submerged in the Christian tradition. So I think this is also an important way of learning from other religious tradition about mission itself. What is it that we can proclaim that is compelling for people today in whatever context we work? Also, another way of learning about mission from other religious traditions is learning about the ways in which other religions have enculturated in various cultures. So obviously Christianity is not the only universalistic religion that has spread its message in different cultures. Other religions have done the same, and often with considerable success. They have enculturated or adapted to different cultures. And I think a way of doing interreligious Missio Dei is learning about the ways in which other religions have adapted to different cultures. The way Buddhism has adapted to China or to Japan, for example, can teach Christianity how it can occupy a certain place in those cultures that complements and adds to what those other religious traditions have to offer. So Buddhism, for example, in China and Japan has been very modest in what the place it came to occupy in those contexts. And so the question may be raised, maybe that's also a way for Christianity to occupy a particular place in those cultures, but other people have much more to say about this topic. Some years ago, I edited a volume also on interreligious dialogue and enculturation, where different religions, I brought representatives of different religions together to learn from each other how they had adapted to the West, because we tend to always think of enculturation as Western religions going to Eastern or African countries, but the reverse form of enculturation also led to very interesting insights. There's also a recent book by Reid Lachlan called Christian Mission, Hindu Mission, where he discusses the way in which Hindu missionaries, particularly of the tradition of Advaita Vedanta or non-duality, have come to the West and proselytized or gained appeal among Westerners without necessarily expecting these people to convert to Hinduism or to the tradition of Advaita Vedanta. And his suggestion is maybe that's also a model for Christianity in Asia and anywhere else, to think of mission not necessarily as a change of religion, but as a form of Christification, as a form of bringing people to Christ without expecting people to change religious traditions. So this is a way in which he, in his recent work, tries to learn from Hindu ways of doing mission and see what Christianity might possibly learn from that. So this is another way of thinking of interreligious Missio Dei. So that's the second way of imagining interreligious Missio Dei. The third way is interreligious Missio Dei as a way of learning about the particularity of Christianity. Now, this is maybe an unexpected way of understanding interreligious Missio Dei, but I believe that it's also a very fruitful or promising avenue for rediscovering the particularity or the uniqueness of Christianity, not so much out of a sense of self-congratulation, but in a way of learning what Christianity might actually contribute to the common good through engaging in interreligious Missio Dei. So I give here this quote from Michael Amalados, another Indian Christian theologian, we have often thought of Christian uniqueness as an a priori reality without engaging other religious traditions. And what interreligious Missio Dei can bring about, I think, is a new way of appropriating, learning about and appropriating our particularity so as to contribute to the common good. And so Michael Amalados, here is the quote, "The word's incarnate manifestation in Jesus has a special role in the historical process, but it cannot be declared a priori, but discovered in and through other manifestations of the word. This gives an important role to Asian churches because all of the world's religions have an origin in Asia. We have therefore a privileged task that we cannot renounce because God has called us to it." So what he calls for is for theologians in Asia, in dialogue with other religious traditions, to rediscover and reaffirm the particularity or the newness of Christianity and of Jesus Christ. And Jan van Nieuw often mentions sort of this expression, the newness of Christ, in his work in India. This is what he tries to bring to his Indian context. Of course, what is particular or unique to Christianity will differ from one context to the other, depending on the religion in question. So this approach to particularity or uniqueness is not an absolute universal approach to uniqueness, but it's always in relation to the religious context or the traditions with which one engages. And so how do we discover then that particularity or that uniqueness? And I have tried to propose some years ago sort of 4 ways in which we can rediscover what is unique about Christianity in other contexts. One would be through the experience of converts. Now, I know that that might be a very controversial way of thinking about it, but it's also true that just as the fact that Christianity is or that Christians are attracted to other religious traditions, the fact that other people from other religions are attracted to Christianity also reveals or surfaces what is unique or distinctive of Christianity. And I think we have maybe become a little shy about that, at least as theologians, but I think that's also a way in which, in particular contexts, the uniqueness or the particularity, the distinctiveness of Christianity can come to the fore. A second way would be through what I have called the nostalgia of religious hybrids. So I've talked in the past about what appeals to religious hybrids in other religious traditions, but I've become more and more fascinated with why religious hybrids want to remain Christian. And because religious hybrids often, are born in Christianity and are attracted to other religious traditions, but there are things in Christianity that they do not want to give up, even though they are attracted to other religious traditions. And so that's a way of approaching, I think, the particularity of Christianity, again, in a particular context through the experience of hybrids. I could give examples of this, but time is running, and we can come back to that later. A third way of discovering the particularity is through what Christer Stendahl has called holy envy. This is a category that's probably familiar to many of you. He talks about sort of people being envious or being envious about elements of other religious traditions that are not in your own religious tradition. And of course, again, as Christians, we usually approach holy envy as Christians being envious of things in other religious traditions, but obviously that also goes the other way around. You know, and Gandhi famously had several expressions and sayings about what he found so appealing in Christianity without actually converting to Christianity or being himself a religious hybrid. So I think in that category of holy envy, what is it that people from other religions find appealing in us as Christians or as Christianity, I think is another source for rediscovering our particularity. And then also the experience of contextual and comparative theologians that have worked for a very long time in other religious contexts and for whom then in going deep in the other tradition, the particularity of Christianity has surfaced or surfaces again. I will just quote Aloysius Pieris again, who stated, "Loving one's neighbor is the Christian way of knowing God. In other words, love is a Christian gnosis, because one who loves does not love one's fellow, because one who does not love one's fellow does not know God. Our love for one another here in the world is the Christian art of knowing God." So for him, after having spent his whole career and life immersed in Buddhism and being very impressed and interested in Buddhism, that is where he saw the uniqueness or the particularity still of Christianity. So he has a famous early book, with Love and Wisdom, in which he also develops that further. So the emphasis on the particularity of Christianity is here meant not to lord one's exceptionality over the other religions or to assert one's general superiority, but rather to find one's particular voice in a more common religious mission and to focus on what one might contribute to a shared commitment to the spiritual and material uplifting of the world. So that is the third way of understanding one's interreligious Missio Dei, and then finally, the fourth way of understanding interreligious Missio Dei would be as a form of purification and collaboration. So here, this is maybe the most obvious way of understanding interreligious Missio Dei, as interreligious Missio Dei is always larger than the church. We all participate in the mission of God as a church. And if God is greater than the church and then our mission, then other religious traditions can also be seen as contributing to that common mission. And so collaboration in uplifting, in liberating people from all kinds of suffering and reminding people of the spiritual dimension of life are two ways in which interreligious Missio Dei can be understood and practiced, but also as a form of purification. And here, Jan van Yu often says that being in the presence of other religious traditions is a way in which Christians are challenged to be at their best. It is a context in which we have to show, demonstrate, live out, practice what Christian living is about. And the famous missiologist Leslie Newbigin also put it as follows: obedient witness to Christ means that whenever we come with another person into the presence of the cross, we are prepared to receive judgment and correction, to find that our Christianity hides within appearance of obedience the reality of disobedience. Each meeting with a non-Christian partner in dialogue therefore puts my own Christian faith at risk. So this form of purification or self-critique, you can say, is already a form of practicing interreligious Missio Dei. But then there's the other side of things, namely the fact that all of the important problems in the world cannot be solved by any one religious tradition. All of the suffering, the poverty, the discrimination, the oppression, every misery that is part of the human condition in different parts of the world has to be tackled in collaboration with other religious traditions. And one way in which that collaboration can happen, Jan van Jeu had this interesting story of living in Varanasi, where people come from all over India to die in the hopes of having a better rebirth or going directly to heaven. And he says it's a really fascinating place to witness to transcendence among people of other religious traditions, because what people fear most, at least in the West, are death and God. And both those elements are particularly at the heart of life in Varanasi, where people are being constantly burned in the dead bodies are being burned in the gut. So you are confronted immediately with death. But also throughout the town, there are temples and mosques and places of religious gathering which remind people also of God or of the transcendence. And so this is, I think, also an interesting way where we can see that we can work together to remind people of this transcendent dimension in a world where people seem to be so afraid of both death and of God. So that's one way of collaboration. But finally, there are all these other ways in which collaboration can occur. So not only in the resacralizing of life, the spiritual elevation, but also in terms of combating violence. And that's where, for example, Pope Francis is particularly insistent on the importance of interreligious collaboration in combating fundamentalist violence and aggression between religious traditions. So he has done so much to try to reach out to Muslims and Muslim leaders in order to work together in order to combat fundamentalist violence. But then also ecology, of course, in our day is one of the most important pressing issues, where no single religious tradition can tackle this enormous problem. And religions themselves have, of course, been partly responsible through neglect, but there's also enormous resources within religious traditions in order to come together to address this huge problem of humanity. And I want to quote Felix Wilfred here today, who states that today it is the earth that holds the prospect of bringing the religions together and so leading them to a meaningful dialogue on God and humanity. So it's a pleasure to be able to bring Felix also into my presentation. But in the latest issue of Verbum that you all got in your bags, Anthony de Luc also has a whole article on ecology and the way in which other religious traditions can inform Christian understanding of ecology, and how we can collaborate in addressing this world challenge. So finally, though religions remain divided and at odds with one another with regard to some of their fundamental beliefs and ultimate goals, there are multiple ways in which they may collaborate in what could be called an interreligious Missio Dei. Such collaboration may lead to mutual learning, to deeper self-understanding, and to joint action for the betterment of society, the saving of the planet, and the bringing about of what Christians call the kingdom of God. And I just want to end with David Bosch's statement: mission is primarily and ultimately the work of the triune God, creator, redeemer, and sanctifier, for the sake of the world, a ministry in which the church is privileged to participate. This boils down to the admission that we do not have all the answers and are prepared to live within the framework of penultimate knowledge, that we regard our involvement in dialogue and mission as an adventure, are prepared to take risks, and are anticipating surprises as the Spirit guides us into fuller understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Catherine Cornille, for this remarkable and inspiring presentation. We will take 1 minute of silence to reflect and interiorize the content that was offered to us. I also appreciate, I would like to join in remembering Professor Felix Wilfred, that was supposed also to be among us this morning. And so we stay silent for 1 minute, and then we have a continuation of the conversation. Okay, we have now about 15 minutes. We will collect 2 or 3 questions, possibly briefly questions, and let the professor answer until the time is okay. I already have one head, please. The gentleman, and then the second and the third. Okay. 3 questions now. Then we let Catherine Cornille to answer.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. My name is Alex. I'm an Indonesian SVD. Thank you, Catherine, for your presentation this morning on interreligious dialogue. As we all know, since the Second Vatican Council, for the Catholic Church, the Church's commitment to interreligious dialogue is at a point of no return. That is what the Church says, meaning that the Church today cannot back out from its commitment to dialogue with other religious traditions. And the Church says it is become an integral part of the Church mission. Yet in practice, it's not an easy thing, nor theoretically or theologically. Theologically, it is not easy. It is also very difficult. Okay, let me just give you an example in this regard. A number of theologians like Paul Nitter, a former SVD theologian in the States, and John Hick, a Protestant theologian, propose renocentrism as a kind of a base or foundation or a paradigm for interreligious dialogue, and reject the paradigm of Christocentrism. That is what they say. And I myself still find it difficult to understand the paradigm that they have proposed. So my desire is, could you please give some comments on this difficult issue?
Thank you very much. The gentleman here. Sister in front here. And then there's a third question.
Yeah, yes, okay.
We will count.
I hope not to steal your time. I'm Joe O'Leary, a great friend of Jim Heisig and of Jan van Bracht. But what the first name you mentioned was Henri Lassault. And I remember reading a book by him long before I came to Japan, about 50 years ago, where he talks about how his monks meditated together, Indian and Western monks, alternately, on the Gospel of John and the non-dual statements of Shankara and the Upanishads. For example, Tattvamasi, that art thou. And the Johannine statement, I and the Father are one. And it struck me that this is the very key to understanding the fourth gospel, not taken up. You talked about difficulties. Well, there's a vast reams of literature on the fourth gospel, which is more and more dull and repetitive, and they never even think of looking over the. And your final quotation from David Bosch reminds us that interreligious dialogue is not a side show. The Vatican Council saw that clearly. It said we have a duty, and John Paul II repeats it in Faith and Knowledge, we have a duty to engage in religious dialogue. But the outrage in the megasphere against Pope Francis, when he said that all religions are a path to God, shows how little we have moved in the church. Still, we still think interreligious dialogue is some kind of esoteric sideshow, and well, I leave it there.
Thank you. Over there, and then I will come to you. Okay. No, first over there. We have 4 questions, and then we let Professor to answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the enriching presentation. My name is Oyidu Okori. I belong to the Society of the Holy Child Jesus. At the course of your presentation, you acknowledged that there are contradictions, in this interreligious learning. And it's very important to acknowledge that. But my question is, are there basic tools you can suggest to sieve, or more or less to weigh these contradictions if we must engage in this learning, this very important learning? Thank you.
Thank you. It's good. Please, Father.
Yes, I am Father Skaria, Capuchin from India, Kerala. See, thank you for this presentation. I would talk on that multiple religious belonging you mentioned. Michael Amaldos mentions about that. But I would say I'm a product of multiple religious formation. Multiple religious formation. Because in my place where I was born, there was a temple, there was a mosque, we lived together. I think that level of experiential side is never given emphasis in all our approach. I was attending an religious harmony in India, and then we are talking about the uniqueness of Christ and universality. These are the 2 things we often hear. But that narrative, how do you define? And one Hindu leader was telling, Christians will do all sorts of nonsense, and they are doing. But remember, there's a non-violent God. I think this is the aspect that Gandhi very strongly proclaimed when he saw this. I think this is an area, in your presentation, or you are adding, how do you approach? We need to go, sideline our definitions and dogmas and touch on this non-violent narrative of God, and which is very much appreciative, and that has to be taken into account, I would say. And then also this experiential side, I found quite success. Create local, ordinary people, meet with them, and create events of like Mahatma Gandhi's prayer meetings. And this, I think, should be a narrative of God as in a non-violent way.
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions? And then we ask Professor Cornille a little miracle to answer to these major questions in 6 minutes or 7. Thank you.
I think some of the questions are a bit related also. So first, the question of Christocentrism versus Regnocentrism and all the tensions between the two. I think it's somewhat related to Joe's question also about Pope Francis's claim that all religions lead ultimately to God. What are the tensions that exist in there? So I think the reason why the emphasis on regnocentrism or kingdom centrism, as Nitter puts it, is controversial is that it often also ignores the centrality of Christ in Christian faith. So there's always a tension in interreligious dialogue between openness to other religions and belonging, or the threat of relativism that might come with saying that all religions ultimately lead to God, which is, I think, a real threat. We have to really acknowledge it. If all religions indeed lead to God, what would be the point then of following Christ and giving up everything for one's faith and committing truly to this particular path that is the way, the truth, and the life, and that is not always compatible indeed with other religious traditions in what it teaches and so on. So I think as Christians, it's important to maintain a kind of normativity, or the centrality of Christ as our core and our norm for what God's revelation means in the world. And that cannot be seen as equally valid as what other religious traditions preach, or otherwise, why are we following Christ? So, but we can affirm that with a sense of humility as well. So this is what we as Christians know. This is what the truth that we as Christians know in faith. That doesn't mean that it is an absolute truth that we know in kind of objective terms what the ultimate truth is. This is our faith and what we know in faith. And I think that that has to be affirmed as the core of our faith, and therefore sort of the emphasis that all religions can lead to God. I think it was completely well-meaning, of course, of St. Francis, of Pope Francis. Pope St. Francis, why not? This was only slightly a slip. It was very well-meaning to say that, but of course, it causes resistance and uproar among bishops and people who have to motivate people indeed to give up everything for the faith of Christ and the church. So I understand why there is resistance to it also, and why there's resistance to John Hick and Paul Nitter's pluralist theology of religions. But I think we can be inclusivist, we can maintain the centrality of Christ in our faith and still be open to other religious traditions, just try to discover how the Spirit of Christ and of God is at work in other religious traditions. So I don't think there has to be a contradiction between a firm commitment to Christ and to Christianity and genuine openness to other religious traditions, as long as we believe that the Spirit is indeed at work in other religious traditions, which is, as we have both emphasized, at the heart also of Nostra Aetate. So it's, I think Christianity has done a lot for interreligious dialogue, and I often get sort of pushback, like, we always take the initiative for dialogue. Why don't other religions take the initiative equally for dialogue? And we often sort of meet with walls when we encounter other religious traditions, that they don't reciprocate in the same way. But I always say, this is also part of our prophetic role as Christians, is to continue to emphasize the importance of dialogue. It's not just a means to an end, it's part of our faith itself. And so that's why I don't see any problem necessarily in continue to try to engage in this openness and dialogue towards other religious traditions. And part of it is also that, look at how many theologians are in the Christian tradition who have thought through all of these questions for a long time now. So we have a basis for, knowing how to remain faithful and open at the same time. And other religions often don't have that kind of theological foundation. And so dialogue for them is often much more scary than it is for us Christians, who can be firmly grounded in our tradition. Nonviolence. 2 minutes. So yes, I don't see how violence can be part of any faith tradition, and every faith tradition teaches nonviolence in one way or the other. You talked about interreligious formation, and indeed, I think all of us are formed interreligiously in the world today. Of course, in India and in countries where pluralism is much more a historical reality, that is much more the case. But now also in the West, everyone is always exposed to every religious tradition, or can be at least exposed to every religious tradition, which is what makes it so exciting and also so threatening. And we've talked already in the past few days about the tension between identitarian sort of religiosity and a kind of openness and post-modern kind of religiosity. This is the reality of our time, where we're sort of caught between those two poles. But it's also not, it is indeed not because we are constantly exposed to other religious traditions that we are necessarily more open. So I have a little bit of experience in India, and sometimes the fact that other religions are constantly there can be also more threatening and close us up more towards other religions. But obviously in Tamil Nadu and in your experience, this is not the case. And there's a lot sort of that religions can learn from each other. And Henri Le Sceau, indeed, I mean, I think it's only after he went to India that he became immersed in Advaita and in dialogue with Hindu sadhus and sannyasins, and try to understand indeed the experience of Christ through the framework of Advaita Vedanta, which opens up enormous sort of possibilities, but also again some challenges for how to maintain the uniqueness of Christ. If what Christ experienced was the experience of Advaita, it is the same experience as every Advaitin. And we have to sort of see how we can preserve the uniqueness of Christ, I think, in reinterpreting Christianity through that framework. And that's what I mean by the limits also of this interreligious Missio Dei. So.
Thank you very much, really, Professor Cornille. Our wonderful organizer, Father Lazar, was very strict when he told me that we should finish on time. So I apologize because we finished a couple of minutes later, but I think it was worthwhile listening to your precious questions and then the precious answer of Professor Cornille. Good continuation on the small groups, and then I will see you back here later this morning. Thank you very much.